The chief priests and the elders asked Jesus, "By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority?" Our band members here today and the army tradition they serve know something about authority. If you serve in the armed forces, the authority lines are crystal clear. An order is given and you follow. No questions asked. And even in this slightly more relaxed environment of a band, you still need to follow the authority of your band leader and conductor. Isn't that right? If we're going to hear the lovely music that we're having today, everyone needs to be on the same page and in time and following the authority of the band leader. Otherwise, well, there'd be chaos. But in our gospel reading today, Jesus has entered the place of ultimate authority for his time and his day, the temple in Jerusalem. Now, the temple was the absolute centre of Judaism, containing the Holy of Holies, where God himself was said to reside at its heart. Solomon was the first one to build the temple, and his temple was destroyed in 586 BC, but not long after, a second temple was built that lasted 500 years. Herod then dismantled that one because it wasn't fancy enough and built the temple of Jesus' time, but just in 20 BC. But the temple for 600 years, effectively, had been at the heart of the worship and the sacrifices of the people of Israel. It was a religious building for their religious rites, but it was also a very political building. Religion and politics were not at all separate in Jesus' day. That's a very modern invention. And the size and the grandeur of the temple, think, St. Matthew's times 25, the size and grandeur of the temple was in competition with the temples of Rome and temples of other gods in the region. The temple was enormous and elaborate and very beautiful. Its purpose was to inspire awe and submission to God, and also submission to the priests who served God. That's something else that we've lost these days. And this submission was political as well as religious, as it claimed the lives of the people of Israel in the way that the temples and the armies of Rome would never do. Until, that is, when the Romans took it apart stone by stone in 70 AD. Today's episode that we heard from the Gospels takes place after Jesus has entered Jerusalem on what we call Palm Sunday. He's come in on a donkey, a humble animal, coming in from one side of the city, and then at the same time on the other side of the city entered Pontius Pilate, the puppet Roman governor, on a white stallion, surrounded by soldiers and symbols of Roman power. Jesus is surrounded by the people waving palm branches, who are not really going to be a match for those Roman soldiers. But nonetheless, Jesus goes into the temple and turns over the tables of the moneylenders and drives them all out, saying, "My house will be called a house of prayer." And then the next day he comes back, and it's then that he's confronted by the chief priests and the elders. "By what authority are you doing these things, and who on earth gave you this authority?" In other words, what are you doing in our temple, and how dare you act in this way? Now, debate amongst the religious leaders of the time was common, and rabbis usually debated backwards and forwards with lots of questions. And so Jesus, instead of answering their question, fires a question back. Was the baptism of John the Baptist something that came from heaven, or was it just of human origin? Was John the Baptist doing God's work, or was he just another in a long line of crazy prophets? And the leaders are afraid to answer. If they say John's baptism was just his own work, then the crowd might turn on them, because the crowd considered John to be a prophet and then a martyr after he was beheaded by Herod. But if they say John's baptism has its authority from heaven or from God, then Jesus is going to ask, well, why didn't you follow John, and then why aren't you following me? So caught between a rock and a hard place, the priests give no answer. So Jesus refuses to answer as well. Quite a clever move. Because Jesus is not about to incite the priests in the crowd. Maybe he's been counselled overnight by the disciples after the table-turning episode from the day before. He's being a little bit more cautious. Or maybe he's also not quite sure himself. By what authority does he teach and heal and reach out? By the time Matthew's Gospel gets written down, the sense of who Jesus is and was is very clear in the mind of the early Christians. But right back then, when it was actually happening, I'm not so sure that Jesus is sure. Does he understand, really, who he is being called to be? He is standing in the temple in Passover week. Tensions are running high. The Jewish leaders and the Romans are doing their usual jostling for power. By what authority does he do these things? He may well have been asking himself that question. By what authority does he do these things? We're looking forward to the show Jesus Christ Superstar that's going to be on at Q Theatre at the end of October. And there's that classic line from the show, Jesus Christ Superstar, do you think you're who they say you are? It's the central question of the show. Do you think you're who they say you are? By what authority do you do these things? And in our postmodern world, authority is not something that we've got much time for, unless you're in the army. We prefer a freedom that lets us decide for ourselves and makes each of us the individual arbiter of truth for ourselves. We value and we encourage independent thinking in our young people. And at school now, our children are being taught how to be discerning amongst the avalanches of information and opinion and possible sources of authority that is the internet. Because even that independent thinking requires reference points and benchmarks. By what values and principles do we make decisions? How do we decide what is best for our children? As a country, we've just been through a collective decision-making process, our election, and it's been a pretty bruising experience for many. How does each political party pick up now and move forward, whether they were winners or losers? By whose authority do they speak? Who do they listen to? By whom are they guided? Those of us who are followers of Jesus look to his life as a source of authority in ours. Yet even he is pretty elusive on this topic by refusing to answer questions. And frustratingly, he doesn't give us a list of do's and don'ts to tick off. He says broad things like, love each other and follow me. It'd be more useful, really, if he gave us a list of rules to live by. So we have to look more, I think, to the manner of his living and dying to find the source of his authority. And our first reading that we heard today sums that up really rather well. It was from Paul, who was writing to the church at Philippi. Paul was in prison when he wrote it, and he writes, or maybe quotes, a hymn of the early church that went, Jesus, though he was in the form of God, emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, humbled himself. Jesus, though he was in the form of God, emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, he humbled himself. So the pattern of life which Jesus offers us is one of humility and service. This is the authority by which he does these things, the authority which comes with humility. Later on, he will take a towel, and wash the feet of his disciples as a slave would have done. He offers himself, pours out his life, as once offerings were made in the temple. The technical theological term for this concept is kenosis, which means a kind of self-emptying. One scholar says kenosis is the essential character of the biblical God. The essential character of God is the principle of emptying of oneself. God's creative energy is always directed outwards. It's always outwards focused. It's always about loving. It's never about condemning. God pours God's self into creation, and God offers us Jesus as part of that outpouring of love. And in turn, Jesus empties himself in the service of God's beloved children. So by what authority do we act? By what authority do we discern and make decisions for our lives and for our children? Well, we model ourselves as best we can on the life of this Jesus who reached out to the last and the least and the lost. This Jesus who challenged the political and religious leaders of his day to be true to their calling. And when they were not true to their calling and they turned on him instead, he poured out his life, literally, showing that death had no power over him. And so we share our lives with those around us, with those who need us. We pour ourselves out in their service as individuals and as community. We serve in our workplaces and in our homes and in our community groups. We serve in the armed services. We serve in music. We serve in all kinds of places. And then when we are the ones in need, we graciously accept the help of those around us. Sometimes it's harder to do that. Sometimes it's harder to receive help than to offer it. But we receive it not just because we need it, but because we are thereby allowing others to fulfill their call to offer themselves in the ongoing creative actions of God. If kenosis, self-emptying, is the essential character of God, then it follows that it is our essential character too. By what authority does Jesus do these things? By what authority do we live our lives? By the authority of the one who creates and loves and dies and lives again, so that we too might live.